Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 60, French General Jean Reynier. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if you'd like to support our podcast monetarily, or if you just want bonus content, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon, where you'll find bonus ad-free content to our wonderful podcast. As always, we thank you for listening and we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a special guest, once again, our good friend Charles Mackay joining us. Hey, Charles, how are you?
Good, John. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for joining the call again. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Charles, he's been on previous episodes. He's a fantastic guest. His Twitter handle is Bubbles the Vampire. And he is a graduate from the University of Arkansas, as well as the Florida State University Institute of French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Studies. So we love having him on. He knows a lot of great things. And who are we talking about today, Charles?
We are talking about French General Jean Reynier.
Jean Reynier, not Reynier, as I call him. Yeah.
Well, I hear you. You're in English pronunciation, and
Yeah.
the French would say Reynier. But
Reynier.
I think if you said Reynier, having lived in Washington State myself, I don't think people would not know who you were talking about. So
Got it. Okay. So Jean was born in January 1771 in, I think it's Lausanne, Switzerland.
Yep, that's right.
And his father was a physician. His brother was an archaeologist. So he came from a very educated family.
Yep, amen.
What do we know of his upbringing?
So his family was French Protestants, French Huguenots, who fled France and settled in Calvinist Switzerland. And his family was a prosperous middle-class family. As you mentioned, his dad was a physician. His brother had enough education to become a naturalist and archaeologist. In fact, he served in several governmental posts, both in Egypt and in Naples under the French. And this was not unusual. As you know, Napoleon took a bunch of savants with him to
Egypt. Yep.
Right. Absolutely. So, and Napoleon was well disposed to scientists who were doing natural things. Napoleon wasn't crazy about abstract thinkers. He liked the hard science.
He liked facts and mathematics and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yep. And so, Reynier had a good education with his family. And originally it looked like he might go into engineering, civil engineer, what today we would call civil engineering. But when the revolution took off and gained some momentum, one of the changes they had made was to essentially grant amnesty for the descendants of French Huguenots who had left, that they were able to come back into France. And so Reynier starts to go to school in France.
Yeah, but it's interesting. The French Revolution is kind of going on at this point, and instead of becoming a civil engineer, he opts to join the French army as an artillery gunner in 1792. What is the history of Swiss troops serving in the French military? I know the history of the Swiss Guards protecting the French kings. Is that a centuries-old thing? Like what started that?
Yeah, that's a centuries-old thing. And to be precise, I do not know exactly when it started. I have a feeling that Louis XIV had a pretty traumatic time of it with the Fronde in France and nobles rebelling against him. And so there was a tradition for the French monarchy to start using mercenaries, the Swiss Guards, at that point to protect. And the Swiss gave the French great service. In fact, on the 10th of August in 1792, when a mob stormed the Tuileries trying to get to Louis and Marie Antoinette, who were still alive at that point, the Swiss Guards were massacred nearly to a person, defending defending Louis XVI.
But they fought for great bravery for mercenaries.
Yes, they really did. And in fact, there's a famous monument to them in Switzerland. And then the Swiss continued to serve in Napoleon's armies after and saw combat from literally from Lisbon to Moscow, the boot of Italy, and everywhere in between.
Yeah, indeed. Well, getting back to Reynier, he quickly sees action at the victorious Battle of Jemappes and at the losing Battle of Neerwinden in 1793. But he fights well. He's promoted to major, and a year later, he was chief of staff to General Souham. Again, merit and promotion really like. I mean, I've read stories where Marshal Lefebvre, it took him 20 years just to become sergeant in the Royal Army.
Right.
So it's just a wonderful time, I think, to be in the military if you can navigate your way upwards.
Right. And we have to be careful how we say that, right? A wonderful time in the military means there are lots of people dying and suffering, but it
True.
does
True.
make open lots of opportunities for advancement that peacetime just do not provide.
Right.
And
Yeah.
certainly the case in the French Revolution. And as you and I discussed in a different podcast, with the revolution stripping away a lot of the restrictions to who could become an officer, it's really easy for guys like Reynier who have enough education, but maybe not the noble background to advance where previously they could not.
Right. And at the age of 23, he's offered promotion to General Reynier is, but amazingly, he turns it down because he thinks he's too young. Do young officers typically turn down promotion?
Not in my experience, but I think maybe a politically adroit Reynier could survey the landscape and see what was going on. And this is a time, certainly in late 1793 and going into 1794, where generals that did not perform to the expectations of French representatives on mission often found themselves 10 or 12 pounds lighter because they had their head separated from their torsos.
Yeah,
So
and it must have been a razor thin wire to walk, because if you're too zealous and you would make rash decisions, you're going to lose battles. But if you're not zealous enough and you're kind of just hanging in the back, not attacking with your army, you also could end up on the guillotine. So it must have
absolutely.
been.
I'm remembering, and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, and I'm sure if not, your listeners will correct me. General Custine won a battle, but then did not pursue the defeated enemy vigorously enough and got guillotined.
Oh my, yeah,
So
yeah.
perhaps Reynier could read a little in the tea leaves and think, I'm just gonna stay. I'm gonna stay at this level a little bit so we can kind of read the tea leaves and see what's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah, smart guy.
Yeah.
Well, in 1795, he finally accepts the general position and takes command of a brigade at age 24, which sounds like a young Corsican we know, doesn't it?
Indeed, it does.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's
yeah,
really moving up through the ranks, Reynier is. A lot of ability.
yeah. In 1796, he becomes chief of staff to arguably the most famous general in France at the time, who was Moreau. And he's also promoted to general of division. A pretty amazing rise in 4 years, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's just the heady times of the revolution and the needs of the French state to, protect itself from, enemies, sometimes self-inflicted enemy, but enemies nevertheless at every gate. So France needs capable leadership, and Reynier was certainly talented.
Right, but I wonder, and it's coming up to my next point, if he was promoted too fast, like maybe it went to his head, because he participates in Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, commands a division at the Battle of Pyramids, which is another victory. But his personality, I've read that he was very reserved and aloof with his subordinates. Do you think he kind of got cocky during this time?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I would characterize it as necessarily cocky, although he does certainly show some evidence of overconfidence, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But
Mhm.
he was incredibly principled, uh,
Mhm.
or he certainly had a lot of conviction in what he believed,
Right.
and was not terribly flexible. Uh, I don't think compromise was something that he was all that used to doing. So I just think he had a lot of conviction in his own abilities, and I think, I mean, maybe fairly you could call it overconfidence, but I think he would he would think that a lot of his experiences had borne out his own convictions.
Yeah,
But
I read that he was very analytical. Like at the Battle of Osaka under Massena, like he kind of realized that climbing that huge mountain and attacking the British wasn't going to work, but he did it anyways. Like I think he was just really, like you said, he had his principles and his convictions, and if he believed something was going to work, he would do it, and if he didn't believe something would work, he maybe if he was in charge, he'd hold off on doing it.
well, and he got a little bit more. Well, he didn't get a little bit more. He got a lot more irascible as the empire went on,
Hmm.
such that and I'm sure we'll talk about it when we get there. But that campaign in 1810 with Massena in Portugal, that's just a train wreck.
Right,
Um,
all around, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But getting back to our timeline here, he's not one of the chosen few to escape Egypt with Napoleon and remained behind with Generals Kleber and Manot to fight off the British. But it seems Reynier was very critical of Manot's leadership and had to be arrested for treasonous behavior in Alexandria. Do you know this story? It's pretty weird.
Um, yeah, I do. And the antecedents of this, a lot of this ill will started even before Napoleon had left. That march from Alexandria to Cairo, where Napoleon essentially cut the corner, went straight through the desert, uh,
Hmm.
was pretty traumatic, and there were a lot of folks complaining. That Napoleon didn't know what he was doing, that he was sacrificing men,
Right.
and there was a lot of questioning of Napoleon's judgment, which led to multiple duels. There were actually a lot of duels during that Egyptian campaign. Um, in fact, Junot challenged Lanuz to a duel, who eventually gets killed, not by Junot, but by somebody else. And
Yeah.
Napoleon forbade dueling, but it still continued. Uh,
And when you say dueling, like pistols, like Aaron Burr and Alexander
or
Hamilton.
or Junot chose to actually offered Lanuz an option, and Lanuz chose sabers, and um, Lon and Murat were both there, and were stunned because Junot had a reputation for being an excellent swordsman. So and
What?
those two, Lon and Murat, broke up that duel before it could. There were blood was exchanged, but neither officer died under that case. But it was not uncommon that Egyptian campaign was stressful like that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
that there were challenges to honor and manhood and all of the things that go with being in the French army in the early 19th century.
Yeah, I read that march was terrible from Alexandria to Cairo. I mean, they didn't have water. They were just going off into the desert and shooting themselves in the head because they were,
Yep.
delirious from
Yep.
thirst.
Yep.
But like you said, it was somewhat of, I guess, unrest, even while Napoleon was there. And then after he left and Kleber gets killed, there's probably even more like, all right, well, who's in charge here? What are we doing? So it must have been a very stressful time to be in the army.
Well, yeah, and so Renier was very critical of Manou's management of the French defenses and just the whole French operation there, and loudly protested, complained bitterly, wrote letters, to the point where eventually, it's undercutting the confidence of the army, and
Hmm.
so Menou has to have Renier arrested, and the general he sends to do it, General Desang, um, has him arrested, and Renier never forgot that. So when they get back to France,
Hmm.
Renier and D'Estaing run into each other again, and this
Hmm.
is where the two of them fight a duel, and Renier shoots him right in the chest, shoots D'Estaing right in the chest, and kills him.
My.
So this was, yeah. So and this
Yeah.
was in, if my memory serves, this is 1802. So you're going back. I mean, this is a feud that continued over the course of not just months but years, that
Yeah.
nursed this grudge and wanted
And that
to.
and that kind of puts Renier in Napoleon's doghouse. Well, why did he despise dueling? I know it was a tradition of the time if someone's honor was insulted, but why did Napoleon hate it so much?
Well, it's a waste of talent
Mhm.
if one of these guys goes down. And I'm sure we've all had coworkers that we could work with easier than others.
Right.
So I think Napoleon's take on it was it's just as easy to move somebody to, separate them, put them into different theaters of operation, and then go from there.
Right. Right.
So
Well,
wasteful.
yeah, indeed, it is wasteful of good talent. But by 1804, Renier was back in Napoleon's good graces, who dispatched him to serve in Italy under Saint Cyr and then Massena.
Hmm.
And in 1806, he defeated a large Neapolitan force at Campo Tenese. So things are going pretty good for him right there.
Yep, absolutely. He's doing fine. Just
Yeah.
muddling along, and he's not in the. So obviously he's not in Austerlitz, and he's not in Jena or Auerstadt, but he's doing good work
Yep. Yep. And I know he
until
helped.
he isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know he helps King Joseph get the throne of Naples locked down, so that's good. But he's humbled shortly afterwards by the British at a loss at Maida.
Yeah.
Um, I've read accounts of that battle. It just seems like he was overconfident. Do you know what happened there?
Yeah, I think he advanced without a lot of preparation. There was not sufficient scouting. The French knew that there was a British there were the British elements in that area, and in fact, Renier was aware that they were making for each other, and he just did not take preparations to plan for the battle, and his advance guard gets mauled, and really it's the some of the French units that finally held firm before he could retrieve enough of the situation to retreat in a somewhat orderly manner from the battlefield. But
Yeah.
the French get thumped.
Yeah.
The French had anywhere between maybe 5,000 and 5,500. The British had perhaps slightly more parity, or perhaps slightly more. But the French, between wounded, killed, and prisoners, lose almost 2,000 men. It was a one-sided affair on the part of
Yeah.
the British.
Yeah. And yeah, if the British would have followed up on that, yeah, who knows what would have happened. But eventually the French kind of take over the Italian peninsula over the next
Yeah,
few.
and the key to that, really, what ends up saving Renier in this case, was that Massena was laying siege to Gaeta,
Gata.
a
Yep.
neighboring fortress,
Yep.
and that fortress is unable to hold out. And
Yeah.
so once that fortress falls, then the British were hoping that maybe they could spur on with the presence of some soldiers an organic local revolt against French domination in that area. But
Yep.
once the fortress fell, that the underpinnings kind of collapse.
Yeah. Well, from there, he serves in 1809 at the epic Battle of Wagram. He takes over Bernadotte's corps when Napoleon basically sends that marshal home. And then he's dispatched to Spain in 1810. And it
Mhm.
seems like a broken record when I ask how, I mean, other than Suchet, whenever I
Yeah.
ask about someone's track record in Spain, it's answered by poor, or not very good.
Yeah, and oh gosh, what could we say about that third French invasion of Portugal at 1810, 1811? So you had a kind of a washed up marshal in Messina who was leading that, although the
Mhm.
emperor himself had thought that he would take command of that army. And imagine how different, and we've talked in a different podcast, but imagine how much different things might have been if Napoleon had commanded. His three corps commanders were his good friend General Junot,
Yep.
Marshal Ney, and the hot-headed and spirited Renier. I think if the three of those had been under Napoleon himself, they would not have had nearly the friction that they had under Massena.
Right. Right.
But Massena was not the energetic general of the 1790s. He dressed up his mistress as a cavalry officer, and
Yep.
that did not inspire much confidence or respect from guys like Ney and Renier, or even Juno if he was sober any of those days. That
Yeah,
nobody
and he's fighting one of the top 10 generals of all time in Wellington.
Right,
So, yeah.
right, and Massena had flashes of certainly competence, if not brilliance. I don't know of another French marshal or general that could have maintained that army in Portugal for as long as he did. And
Right.
obviously, enduring like the siege of Genoa back in 1800, Massena's a tough guy.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know that another French general would have been able to accomplish what he did, but
I
they that whole endeavor was just at Busaco, you had mentioned Busaco earlier, and Renier getting, tasked with mounting that ridge
no.
there.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine if you haven't been to that ridge. It's hard to imagine, an impediment to an army that would be as daunting as that one was.
Right. It
And
wasn't like a gentle rising slope. It was almost like a mountain.
it really was so much
Yeah.
so that and maybe this will help the listeners a little bit. When you put a tube of artillery at the top of the ridge is so steep you could not point the tube down
Hmm.
to provide any defensive fire. So the British have artillery on the ridge, but it can't help them because the pitch is too steep.
Right.
So
Right.
these French are trying to assault this hill literally on their hands and knees as they're going up this, and it's a lot more wooded today than it was back then, but that the French units got up to the ridge at all
It was a
is
miracle.
just,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing. And they did, and they form up, and then of course the British and the Portuguese are waiting for them,
Yeah.
and there's just, I mean, they're butchered. And
Yeah.
Renier did not want to do this,
Yeah.
to make this attack. And Massena was lazy. There were ways around that ridge, and
Yeah.
he just didn't spend the time and the energy to find the workarounds.
Right.
In other words,
Well,
he could have maneuvered Wellington's force off that ridge
yep.
without firing a shot,
Right.
but
He chose not to. Yeah.
well, he got impatient. Kind of like Napoleon at Borodino, right? Okay, the enemy's finally here; they're finally standing. Let's go right at him.
Right.
And
Well,
Renier wasn't having it.
yeah. Yeah. And, they eventually come across the lines of Torres Vedras and just basically starve there and lose another 25,000 troops just starving in
Yeah,
disease.
the fortifications there were deemed impenetrable,
Yeah.
and right, and Messina, I don't. I mean, I don't know how in the world he sustained that army. I don't think the British knew how in the world he sustained that army, um, as
Yeah.
long as he did. But ultimately, they have to retreat, of course.
Yeah. I have to go
And
back and Spain. Yeah.
nobody's in a good mood when you retreat.
Yeah. Well, in 1812, Renier is recalled from Spain to take part in the huge invasion of Russia and is stationed with a Saxon corps along the southern flank. So thankfully, he misses a lot of the heavy fighting at Borodino and
Right.
Smolensk, but there's still some clashes, right? He's working with Schwarzenberg down south.
Yeah, and that required some skill too, because it wasn't always entirely 100% sure. Renier wasn't which side Schwarzenberg was on,
Right.
because frankly, I don't think Schwarzenberg was sure 100% of the time whose side he was on. And his government kept sending him conflicting messages, and
Mhm.
so that posting required a bit more skill than just planting troops on a position and saying, okay, front towards enemy.
Right.
Renier had to exercise some judgment here about just Austrian dispositions and Russian dispositions, and had to continually assess the viability and loyalty of the Saxons, because we know famously at Leipzig the Saxons mid-battle switched sides.
Yeah, and even in the Russian campaign, the Prussians basically made a separate peace and left MacDonald out to dry, Marshal
Yep,
MacDonald,
yep.
and and that could have happened to Renier with the Austrians. They could have gotten a letter at any time that said, "Okay, attack the French now," and so Renier probably had to keep his eye on what the Austrians were doing.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. So that's not easy service in any part of Russia, by the way.
correct.
In terms of all the challenges that the French army had with the super hot and dry summer, slaughtering the animals en masse because of the lack of water and food, and then constantly being harassed by Russian forces and Cossacks and whatnot. And then,
Yeah.
the winter isn't that much easier on Reynier.
Yeah.
Now, he did not have to go back through the battlefield at Borodino,
Yeah.
and it was marginally easier to feed soldiers there than it
Mhm.
was retracing the same entry route that the Grand Army had taken to Moscow. But
Right.
that's not easy service.
No, it's not. And I think all of this is taking its toll on Renier, and we're coming up to why I say that. He fights in several battles in 1813, the German War of Liberation, and suffers a few setbacks. He's captured during the Battle of Leipzig, which, as we all know, is a big fiasco for Napoleon, but is later freed during a prisoner exchange. And then, tragically, he dies 2 weeks after he's released from gout. Do you know, like, I mean, a gout, obviously today we don't think of it as a big deal, but it was a big deal in those times.
Yeah, and of course that's a reflection of eating a diet high in fatty foods, and traditionally it's associated with royalty and folks that have a sedentary lifestyle, which
Yeah.
Renier definitely did not have.
Right.
And he was not a large man.
Mm.
He was in good health most of his life. And I'm a little mystified as well by that, by that ending, because it seems really unlikely for a guy of Renier's stature and education that would be the thing that would do him in.
Yeah. Yeah. He dies in February 1814. What was your opinion of him as a divisional commander? I know he had some highs and lows.
He was one that was I would put him in the upper tier of the French generals, and you can kind of see. So typically it's a marshal that commands a corps, but occasionally
Mm-hmm.
generals commanded corps as well, including Renier.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Napoleon had a lot of respect for what Renier could do. Um, Probably a small thing, but in the army of Portugal, Ney was relieved of command when Renier was not.
Right.
Although he advocated forcefully for his positions,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps wasn't personally terribly well liked, he still did his duty.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the most interesting things I've read on his life story is what I'm about to go over this quote to you. After Renier dies in 1814, February, Napoleon writes his war minister, General Clark, quote, I am surprised that nothing has yet been done to honor the memory of General Reynier, a man who served well, who was an honest man, and whose death was a loss for France and for me, end quote. I find this incredible because this is, Napoleon's got 2 months left in his empire. He's fighting for his life, and he takes the time to sit down and write a letter to get Renier the proper respect he deserves. Isn't that incredible?
Well, yes and no. So, part of this is answered by the fact that Napoleon, even until his last days, had an incredible capacity for work.
Mm-hmm.
And he would have multiple secretaries, and he would talk to one about preparing to move 100 pairs of shoes,
Mm-hmm.
from Liège to, say, Mainz. And then the next person he would talk about appointing a judge for the Côte d'Or department. And then
Right.
the next one he would be, moving troops from this location to this one. And so, that he would say at that moment in time to a secretary, I'm surprised nothing's been done for Renier. That
Right.
that in itself doesn't surprise me. It also doesn't surprise me, especially Napoleon had lost several really close friends at this point. Duroc had died in
Right.
1813. Beziers had died in 1813. He
Yep.
lost Laon in 1809. And
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of these he'll lose Junot in July of 1813. So a lot of these personal losses start to make Napoleon, well, he was already sentimental.
Right.
And I know that seems odd for some people, especially the people that regard him as a monster.
Hmm.
but he had a sentimental side
Right.
that was consistent. And so I think also maybe the fact that Renier was a gunner,
Hmm.
not unlike Napoleon,
And
gave him an easier way to kind of, see and imagine
and
Renier's, course of his career.
and we talked about this in the Junot episode. He appreciated loyalty above all else and good service above all else. So I think when you talk about Junot or Marshal MacDonald or Renier, who maybe they didn't have spectacular victories, they always served wherever the emperor wanted them to serve. They went to wherever he wanted them to be, and I think that says a lot about Renier.
Correct. And I also think that Renier and Napoleon didn't until, 1813, didn't spend an awful lot of time near each other.
Hmm.
So the fact that Renier might have had a reputation for being honest and a straight shooter
Hmm.
uh, might have impressed Napoleon. But if Renier was barking in Napoleon's face about all the things that he was barking to Massena or others, I'm not sure Napoleon would have had as charitable of a
Right,
of a
right,
take.
right. Or what he
Um,
was saying to Minot back in Egypt. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. But Napoleon at the same time is coming to appreciate the talents of somebody like Marshal MacDonald,
hmm, indeed.
who provides good service. Despite the fact that he got munched at the Kotzbach, you know, he
Yeah.
provided good service in 1814 and was always honest and didn't tell Napoleon what he wanted to hear. I think he cast Renier in that same sort of light.
Well, I think another part of it is it's easy to have friends when things are going well, but when things are going poorly, and like people are like, oh, I need to go away on sick leave, and McDonald and very few others stayed by his side, and I think he was looking for people who wouldn't leave his side at this time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Renier, I think Renier would be a good choice for someone who would remain loyal like that. And then we'll never know ultimately because of course he dies. He dies shortly before the first abdication. So we'll never know if he would have rallied to Napoleon. I
Right.
kind of think he would have.
Yeah, I think
Um,
so too.
I don't think Renier had any particular love for the Bourbons.
No, I agree. Well, thank you for that, my friend. That was very succinct, but very detailed. That was a good overview of this general, and I appreciate your time on him.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you again. Again, it's Bubbles the Vampire on Twitter, and we hope to have him back on soon.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.